Hi, everyone. Here we are again. It's still September, Suicide Awareness Month. And this is going to be my third interview. Actually, we're going to do this differently because both of us want to have this conversation. That's what we're going to call it, right, Aaron?
Absolutely.
On both of our podcasts. So it's going to be back and forth, me and him, and just having a conversation about what the podcasts are and what we do, the kind of content, the people we interview. But the idea for both of us is to give more resources and offer resources to our listeners. This is about collaboration. This is about doing this together. We are in this together. Suicide prevention is our main objective here. And just so I can introduce him, his name is Aaron Wanserski. I had to
Perfect.
train, I had to
Perfect.
practice a little bit before. And he is the host of the podcast, the Center for Suicide Awareness. So we're going to talk to him, have a conversation. And actually, I actually had to stop him a little just 2 minutes ago because he was telling me this wonderful story of how he got involved with suicide awareness and with the podcast. He had the idea of doing the podcast, but it's actually an organization, and we're going to talk about this. But I would like to start there. Let's pretend we didn't have the previous conversation when you
Sure.
started telling me the story, and I said, "Oh no, stop," because I want to hear that and I want to share with my listeners so they know why you do what you do. And what he told me was, I mean, he was with the police force for 12 years, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I
Yeah.
can kind of just get into it. That's not very hard for me to do at all. So yeah. So again, my name's Aaron. Thank you so much, Paula, for having me on. I appreciate it. Like I said, this is very different for me too, because I'm usually the one that's interviewing, not
Uh-huh.
having like a co-interview kind of one. So this is kind of a new experience for me too. Bear with me as well. But
Of course.
and I was telling you before we started, I said I had to phonetically spell your name as well, so it's Fontenelle. So you got
Yes.
my name right, I got yours. We've made sure that that's good now.
We
But
did it. We did it.
exactly. So no, thank you so much for having me on. I do appreciate that. So yeah, like I said, I'm Aaron. I'm the video game outreach director for the Center for Suicide Awareness. So my job entitles a lot of the online community for their mental health resources and suicide prevention, including trainings, set up fundraisers, things like that for our organization.
Mhm.
We are a nonprofit. We're based out of Kaukauna, Wisconsin. So if you're familiar with Wisconsin at all, we're about 20 minutes south of Green Bay. If that's like the best way to put it usually.
Mhm.
So yeah, I guess from how my perspective, how I got involved with this thing was kind of a very fluke happenstance. So right out of high school, I said I wanted to do a job that I didn't want to just sit at a desk all day. I wanted to be out there. I wanted to be doing something. So I followed in the footsteps of my uncle and became a police officer. So I did my training. I did all of my academia stuff, the stuff I needed to get. And lo and behold, I got a whole bunch of different like part-time gigs where you're an officer, but you're not necessarily an officer. So I was working with departments
Mhm.
around here. And just amazing. It was such an awesome opportunity. I loved every second of it. And then finally landed a full-time gig at an agency that's local here and did that for 9 years there. But
Mhm.
at the end of year 9, I could feel like my life was changing for the better. I was getting married, things were great. I was having a kid on the way,
Mhm.
or actually a second kid on the way, excuse me. But all the while, I guess I never realized the effects that job played on my mental
Mhm.
health. I grew up in a world where mental health was not necessarily talked about because it wasn't known. So, and I've said this before on my podcast, I said, no fault to my parents whatsoever. They didn't know, they didn't have any idea what I was going through, or I didn't even know what I was going through. I just thought that was normal life. Anxiety shouldn't really be a part of normal life, but it is. And
Mhm.
I didn't have a name for it. So, um, back in 2019, I made the decision to leave law enforcement. hardest decision I've ever made because it was the only thing I ever knew how to do. And I left because if I ultimately would have kept going, I probably would have killed myself. And I mean that wholeheartedly. And I'm glad that I made that decision. And it was the help of my wonderful wife that really did drive that decision to say it's okay to leave and it's okay to try something different. You know, having that support was crucial. And so I left and I had no idea what to do. I didn't know where to go or who I was going to be at that point. But I ran into our executive director. Her name is Barbara Gulke. She, the summer prior to me leaving in October, we had talked about an initiative she wanted to start with the center. And that was kind of in the video game world, in the online world, because it was an untapped resource that really didn't have a lot of go-to places for mental health. So we were talking, and her famous line of, well, let's go get coffee and talk, turned into me becoming full-time with the center and kind of formulating this job that had no job description whatsoever. And then it's like, all right, you're just jumping into a world, because I'm a gamer. I love that. So I was like, all right, let's see what I can do. And then COVID happened. COVID happened in 2020. And it was like, what do you do? How do you fill this time? You can't, we all had to go into this world of isolation and computer and Zoom and all of these things. And the one thing I always said to her was, I wanted to start a podcast, because there's a lot of valuable resources when it comes to meeting people through podcasting. And I was like, we have to try this. There's so many people that have a great story. And I said that, and the second I said that, I go, that's the theme. Everybody has a story. Everybody has a story.
Great line.
And so I wrote that down real quick, and I was just kind of doing this, and I'm like, well, it can't be too hard to start a podcast. And I was so wrong. It is. It's a lot. And I was happy.
Are you telling me?
Yeah, I know,
My
right?
big dream is to have help for this, editors, people to contact guests. It's at least, I would say, 10 hours I spend every week on this podcast.
Absolutely.
At least.
I always tell people, I said, depending on which program you use, an hour podcast turns into like 5 hours of post work that needs to be done. And how true that is. So I had no idea how to start one. It was very much like Google, how do you start a podcast? I was like, all right, let's just try it. So they're like, well, you need to do this, the equipment, blah. I'm like, yeah, I know that, but how do you start one? So I learned. I completely just started piecing things together, finding what worked for me. And I was like, all right, I'm going in with this podcast for the center, and we're going to make it, we're going to talk to survivors. We're going to make sure we talk to people with mental health. And that lasted 2 episodes. And then all of a sudden I had contact from people that necessarily didn't have any sort of mental health issues or had any suicide background, but they had valuable information that could be used in that group. So I was like, so our third guest, his name was Greg Delaney. I will never forget that, because that was the turning point for our podcast. He is a expert in the field of substance abuse and like alcoholism. And so we started talking about that, and it was just an amazing story, because he's like, the reason why people use this when they're depressed is because, and it was just this like completely different realm. Yes. Yeah. And it was just kind of this awesome conversation. And I said, why should I limit myself? Why should this podcast limit itself to just this? Let's find something different. So we started throwing it out to people. Anything, you have a story. And I really followed that mantra that I had started from the beginning, that everybody has a story. It doesn't matter if you've been affected by suicide, or you have mental health problems, or you have resources for it. I wanted to hear it.
I get it. As long as it helps your listeners, right?
Exactly. And that was the key goal to it. And I was so happy that I shifted that mindset, because it made me a better podcaster, learning at the same time, and also kind of seeing how this went. It was just a kind of a catch-all thing. And I'm just so happy that I started doing it. And now it's just grown tremendously in the sense of who we've had on guests and just who we've talked to. Some people in a million years, I would never thought I would ever talk to. I talked to a man, his name is Jesse Leach. He is the lead singer of one of my absolute favorite bands, the band
Really?
called Kill Switch Engage. I'm a metalhead, so I'm really, I know it's not for
I'm
everybody.
feeling so old right now.
No,
You
no.
when people start talking about bands you never heard of, you're old.
Well, so I grew up just listening to metal and
Yeah,
heavy
of course.
music.
Yeah.
That was my coping skills. It
Yeah.
was. And so
Yeah.
hearing him and then hearing how big of an advocate he was for
Yeah.
mental health and getting to talk with him just like we are now
Yeah.
was this massive dream of mine.
Amazing, isn't it?
I'm getting
Yeah.
goosebumps just
Yeah.
talking about it because I'm
I
so
know how you
excited.
feel because it's the same for me. Authors that I absolutely love, I contact them and then they come to the show and say, wow, what a great opportunity, right?
It really
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
And I was just, we had Ginger Z. She's the chief meteorologist of ABC Good Morning America. We
Hmm.
had her on, and it was just like,
Amazing. Yeah.
I don't know how I did this, but it's
Yeah.
like I created something from my brain and it just is now working in this
Yeah.
amazing direction. So,
Yeah.
and we're helping a lot of people. I know I'm going to talk a lot and I apologize because that's what I'm so used to doing. But I just had somebody the other day, because September is Suicide Prevention Month.
Yeah.
We have been so busy with
Mm.
different like
Yeah. I
functions that we've
know. I
had to.
know. I'm
Yeah,
there. I'm
it's
there.
I hear
I'm
you.
doing lives with Brazil every week.
Yes, yeah, it's a lot. I mean, especially in September, I don't think people realize how busy it is. Every
Mm.
day I've had something. But I had somebody message our Facebook page and said, "Hey, is your podcast coming back? I really miss it." And I'm like,
Mm.
it had to take a back seat for this time. I'm sorry, but it
Yes.
did. And
Mhm.
now I can finally kind of get back on that train. So,
Mhm. Aaron,
but
tell me a little bit about the center. What does it do? Because I know it does trainings, right? You also have a helpline. What else does
yes.
it do? Because my
So,
listeners are thinking, okay, how can I maybe
yeah,
volunteer or
yeah, absolutely.
maybe they need
So,
the service? Yeah.
yeah. So the center, we're, like I said earlier, we're a nonprofit. We're not just locally based. We're completely nationally based, as far as, our services. Uh, Basically, our whole mantra at the center is we want to do everything we can to provide support to those people that's either contemplated, attempted, been affected, or have even know somebody that has been affected by suicide
Mm-hmm.
and mental health,
Yeah.
because those two obviously go hand in hand. And the biggest thing is that we pride ourselves on being completely unbiased. You are you, and we want to make sure that we accommodate to what you are. We
Mm-hmm.
don't have boundaries in that sense. If you want to identify as a duck, sure, let's do it. That's fine. But the amazing thing is that we will try to reach anybody in the realm that they're at. So we're kind of very unconventional in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
However, the one thing that we are known for is the Hope Line. It was something we created back in 2014. It is a text-based emotional support service that we offer. It's
Mm-hmm.
completely free, 24/7. So if somebody in the United States at this point only can text the word Hope Line to 741-741, and you're connected to a counselor that we have trained through a model that we created, or
Mm-hmm.
through Barb that created it. And you can talk about that issue. You can talk about whatever you're facing. It doesn't necessarily have to be suicide. It could just be, I'm having a bad day. I'm having an anxiety attack. I'm worried about money. I don't know what to do for my spouse who is going through this, or I don't
Mm.
know, any sort of resource. It's there. And it's an amazing thing that we've seen, because it has, since COVID, has just skyrocketed. Problems
Really?
have been
Has it
yes,
changed? Yeah.
absolutely. It's been so much more utilized, because isolation and mental health are just that perfect recipe for bad decisions, I guess is the
Oh,
best way to
yes.
put it. It is. And so we've seen how it's played a role in people. And that's why we have been so
Mm-hmm.
heavily involved in actually getting that message out there. So
I'm so
yeah,
curious. I don't know
it's been
if you guys have had access to numbers, but at least the first numbers I saw, and I think I was looking at them 2 weeks ago, is actually the number of suicides went down in the US, 5%.
that's that's the
But
statistic.
that's not a final statistics in COVID. I mean, and I'm talking about COVID, of course. I mean, since COVID.
Right, right. And
But
that's the
mental health has skyrocketed. Yeah,
yeah, absolutely. And
diagnosis.
that's the statistic we've seen as well. However,
Mhm.
I can't say that I fully believe that entirely, because
Mm.
we've seen, especially in our area, we've seen a lot as well. And
I
it's
have to
just,
say,
it's
me
hard to
too.
believe that.
Yeah, my
Yeah.
experience is the same. I've never had as many people contact me, either from Brazil or from here, because someone just died by suicide. One of my
Eh,
good friends from my hometown just took his life 2 weeks ago.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah,
I'm so sorry to hear
yeah,
that.
and people were like calling me all day, and it was a mess. Really unexpected one of those. I had, oh my god, I don't think I ever heard so many cases about so many cases. And
It's it's
it's
a
hard to
hard thing
believe.
to
Yeah,
have.
it's hard to believe. You're
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
So, Paula, I have been talking your ear off. I need to hear more about you, though. And so, yeah, I know it's just funny. I get into that realm of where we're talking and then I just keep going. But I need to hear about you. I need to hear about how you started your podcast, how you got involved
Mm.
with suicide prevention. So, yeah, please tell me all about that. I want to hear.
Yeah, so my podcast is called Understand Suicide. And the reason why I started it, I've been working with suicide prevention for 15, almost 16 years now. And it started with the death of my father in 2005. He died by suicide. And back then, I had no history of suicide in the family, even
Really?
friends. It was something very, very, very far. One of those, it only happens to other people. And when it happened, I was so confused. I was just drenched in questions. How? For me, the biggest question, I never had a lot of difficulties understanding why. I knew
Mm-hmm.
why. I knew what he was going through. For me, the biggest question was how? How can someone get to that point? That's what
Yeah.
and I started this search and I started reading. And in Brazil at the time, there was nothing, not a book on suicide. It was such a huge stigma that I decided after, because fortunately I already spoke English by then, and I started reading. I got a lot of books from here, the
Yeah.
US, Australia, UK. These are, I think, the three most advanced in suicide prevention.
Sure.
So I read everything I could get my hands on. And I decided, okay, I need to fill this gap. It's my responsibility as a journalist. That's what I did then. I was a journalist. And I had already one published book at the time. So I decided to write the book on suicide prevention, telling the story of what happened to my father. But it's way more than that. I actually interviewed most of the uh, authors that I had read and specialists here. So I wanted to answer that question. How can someone get to that point of such unbearable pain that they see no way out? So
Yeah.
I did that with the book, and then I started a web page in Brazil. But 5 years ago, I moved here and then that's the thing. It totally changed my life. I decided to leave journalism and become a therapist because,
Yeah.
again, it would be part of the work. So I did my 5 years of training in psychoanalysis, then came here and finished a master's in mental health, clinical mental health. And then I
Wow.
decided,
Wow.
I need to reach more people because I have this very solid work in Brazil in Portuguese, but Portuguese is a very limiting language, right? Not many places speak Portuguese.
Right. I can't think of too many that do. Yeah.
No, only Portugal, Brazil,
Right. I think
even though we have 200 something million people, but still it's just one country, right? So
right.
Portugal, Brazil, a few little countries in Africa. But anyway, I decided I have to do something in English because I want to reach more people. There's so many out there who need this. And
Yeah.
that's when I was here, I was doing my master's. One day I remember I was getting into podcasting and I was so into it. I still am. I wish I had more time to listen more podcasts, but I was very much into it. And one day I was just home and said, I should do it. I should do a podcast because there was
Right.
really not much either in podcasts. And then there isn't in terms of
Yeah.
suicide prevention, not at
There's
all.
not. There's not.
No, not at all. So I decided, okay, I have to do this. So I did the web page. And then I updated my book. I wrote another chapter and published in English and started the podcast 2 years ago. Actually, just in September, it's 2 years. So
That's
that's why I
amazing.
do. It's part of it became my mission. I'm now a therapist. I work a lot, and that's my passion is suicide loss. So I
Do,
work with grief and grieving families.
do you find being a podcaster being very therapeutic for you?
I'm not sure.
Minus the work, minus the work part
Minus the
of it.
work. You know what I think? I think the book was therapeutic for me. The book
Mhm.
was, even though it was the hardest thing I ever did in my life. I had to stop twice. I had to start
Yeah.
treatment for depression along the way because I was reliving that pain and my father's death.
Yeah.
So it was really hard to do. But podcasting for me is actually going back in time. My first job was as a radio reporter.
Oh,
So
sure,
yeah,
sure.
and I loved it. It's actually the only thing in journalism that I missed. So I thought, you know what, this is perfect. I have the skills to interview. I can bring in people that I want to meet. It's great for
Yeah.
networking. And as you said, and I'm going to help way more. You know how last week I was checking, my podcast has listeners from 121 countries.
Wow.
Isn't that
That's
amazing?
it is, because you
It
think
just
about
shows the
that.
need, right?
It shows the need, and it shows how many people you've reached. I mean, I don't think we're in 120 some countries. Maybe we're in like,
But you just
I'll go
started.
50.
Yeah.
I'll go
50?
50. But at the same time, that's so amazing. Think of, you're reaching people from all across the world, people you'll never meet, but
Yeah.
they know you, and you're bringing them
Yeah.
a valuable
Yeah.
resource.
And I know, and I would never do this, never be able to do that in Portuguese, that's for sure.
Right, right. Oh my goodness.
So I'm really happy with it. And I think, like, you know, the feeling, I have these great people that come on the show. And
Yeah.
my sisters always make fun of me because sometimes I'll call them, I got the best interview today. I said, Paula,
Yeah.
again.
Right,
Because I'm
right.
so excited about it. And I'm
What?
so happy because I see, for me, the main objective of my podcast is to bring a message of hope to my listeners, either those who are
Yeah.
struggling with suicidal ideation or those who lost someone to suicide. So,
And
yeah.
I think it's really amazing when people are, when they're able to share that story with others, and really it brings this connection to people through sharing about their loved one, or sharing about their experience with it,
Mhm.
because it only empowers people to talk about it more, and to
Yeah.
break that stigma,
Yeah.
so that it doesn't continue. Like,
Yeah.
and pardon me for asking, and I hope that this is okay, but I'm very curious. You said that there was really no virtual warning signs with your father or anything like that.
Not really, but not really at the time. Now that I know the warning signs, they were all there.
Yeah.
100%. My dad is that it's a case of tick when you read the warning sign, especially
Right.
especially the ones that I call the red, the red lights, the ones
Yeah.
that actually indicate that you have advanced to planning, which
Yeah.
are, yeah, when you start getting rid of your stuff, even if it has
Yeah.
sentimental value, when they start calling people to say goodbye, when you start getting your affairs in order, paying your debts. So these
Yeah.
things becoming very nostalgic, not talking about the future. He did them all. He did them all.
Yeah.
But of course, and that's why I think it's so crucial what you do and what I do is to really bring information and
Yes.
circulate this information. Because if I knew then what I know now, I would know. I know because it happened to me. I've had a friend who called me, and it took me, Aaron, maybe a minute to know she was calling to say goodbye. Immediately she called, and I said, listen, I can hear by your voice that you're calling to say goodbye. Are you thinking about suicide? And she just burst into tears.
And that's how powerful is it that when you're able to give people these resources, it sounds so simple. It sounds so simple to ask them a question. I think it's so uncomfortable for people because they don't want that to happen, that they just never bring it up. And then
Yeah.
afterwards they see these things, and it's just, maybe it's, they don't know that either.
No, no,
But
and there is power in knowledge, and there is sometimes. Well, is it enough to know? Of course it is. You can't
yeah,
help if you don't. You can't help if you don't know the warning signs. And
exactly.
most importantly, you can't help if you don't know what to do next,
Right,
because you can make
right.
huge mistakes by okay,
Yes.
you notice, and then what do? That's a
Yeah.
very important step too. I actually just launched my a course on that, on online
Wonderful.
course,
Tell me about
how
that.
to yeah it's called how to help suicidal people. So first I start by talking about self-reflection. The first thing you have to do is think about how you see suicide, because that's going to impact this conversation
Yeah.
hugely,
Yes, it will.
right? Do you
Yep.
have biases? Do you think it's a cowardly thing to do?
Yes.
So all these things you have to first sit down with yourself and ask some very tough questions. And I go through
Yeah.
it's a video, it's 6 videos, 6 modules, and you go through getting ready, what kind of information like emergency numbers, all these things that you need to before you sit down to have the conversation. How can you get ready and prepare for the conversation
Right.
emotionally too, because that's a very
Yeah,
tough one.
it is. If you're not experienced with it, going in with no knowledge or anything after
Yeah.
forethought of asking that question, that's very intimidating because
Yeah,
they're
one
relying
of
on you then.
of course, not only that, but you can silence them just by asking the question in the wrong way. If you
Yes.
ask, listen, like I did with my friend, I can tell there is something going on in your life. Is there a way I can help? Are you thinking about suicide? That's one way, right? But here's another way. And you would throw them off and they will shut down and they will not talk to you. Some
Right.
people do that. They'll go and say, you're not thinking about suicide, are you?
That's
See?
just
See the
stop that
difference?
last two words. Stop those last two words.
Yeah.
Yes. Because it
The
shows
tone, the tone of
judgment.
voice, the
Yes.
judgment. Who on earth is going to say yes to that question?
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. There is, it's inflection makes a difference. It's all of these things. I
Body
actually,
language, body language.
yes, absolutely. I remember we give just like a very brief training like for different organizations for signs and symptoms of suicide. And
Mhm.
somebody asked me, they said, what if I don't know how to form like the words to say it? I said, obviously there's ways you don't say it, but if you want to ask somebody, I said, sometimes it's not having that script, but it's also just having the courage to ask that question. Are you thinking of suicide?
Mhm.
Because at least then it's out there and it's showing
Mhm.
that you're not judging them. It's showing that you
Yeah.
want to help them.
Mhm.
And most of the time, at least in my experience in law enforcement, when you ask somebody that question in a very compassionate way, they will open up to you and they will
They're
either open up in the
relieved.
sense
They're
of
relieved.
verbal
Yeah.
or crying or something. Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I think it's very valuable to have something like that.
Yeah, yeah. So the course goes through that, and then it talks about, of course, risk factors, a lot of
Mhm.
considerations there, because as you know, some risk factors can become a protective factor. It's a very tricky
Yes,
thing. So warning signs, and especially I have 2 videos over an hour of what to do and what to avoid.
that's
Yeah.
how incredible is that? I mean, for one, for you to take the jump to try it and to do it. And have you seen success in this?
Oh, yes.
Good,
Especially, you
good.
know what I've seen success mostly, I think, training of mental health professionals. You would
Yeah.
not believe the horror stories I hear from patients, from people I know, from families I interview, the horror stories they tell me that they heard from mental health professionals.
Wow. Yeah.
You
And
would you wouldn't believe. I'm
I
actually publishing today because I have just been invited by Psychology Today to be a
yeah.
blogger and yeah,
Congratulations.
but
That's
thank you.
awesome.
So I just published today. I just submitted to them my first blog post, as they call it, and it's
Yeah.
about that. And it's about one of the things that not many people talk when it comes to suicide is the fear that we lost survivors have that we're going to do the same. That is
Yeah.
such a taboo question to ask. But
It
I see this in families all the time. They keep asking, would I do it? Is this something that I will catch? Right?
which I mean to somebody that knows that, I mean, you have to understand that. And I think with suicide, I call it, with my own issues, how it's so seductive. It makes it seem like it's going to fix everything. It makes it seem like it's going to fix all the problems that I feel I can't handle. But then realizing that that's only just this shadowy veil of the worst thing that you could potentially do to yourself, because
And
there's
to
so many
others, to
people that
those who are left behind, right?
exactly. Yeah. And I think about that. I think about the calls that I've gone to. Again, I revert back a lot to law enforcement because that was the realm that I knew for how long. And I see the families that were destructed by it. And they always ask me that question in uniform, doing what I'm doing. They ask, why would they do this? How do you answer that?
Yeah,
Like that's
it's
a
so
heavy question.
individual, and it's an individual.
Yes.
You can't really generalize.
Right.
You can't say, oh, it's because of this. It's a multi-factor answer. You really can't. Even I remember in the beginning, in the 90s, we used to associate like 90%. And I think Dr. Edwin Schneidman, whom I absolutely love, the father of
Yeah.
suicidology,
Right.
I had the honor of interviewing him for my book, but we used to use this number: 90% of suicides are related to mental illness. That's not true anymore. We know that many times it's not. There are many cases, and actually in 2018, in the US, 54% of suicides were unrelated to mental illness.
Really?
So yeah, that's something that reversed. But of course, there is a correlation, but not a causation. So we have to
Sure.
be
Sure.
very, very careful with that.
That
There,
yeah.
yeah, there is depression, especially depression is associated directly with suicide, but it's not just that. I mean, it's personal crisis, it's personality traits, it's what's happening in your life, the kind of social support that you have. There's so
Absolutely.
many things
There's
related to
so
that.
many environmental factors. There's so many
Yeah.
physical factors. I can recall somebody that I had talked to who had severe pain daily, no hint of any sort of mental illness, nothing like that. But they're like, I can't deal with this anymore. Doctors aren't giving me what I need. They're not wanting to do this for a risk. Why wouldn't I just end this? Because I don't want to feel this anymore.
Yeah.
No mental. Yeah.
I have one of my episodes is on chronic pain
Yeah.
because it's associated with suicide. And
I'll have to listen to that because I have some
yeah,
sciatica issues, so I would
you
love to
do.
hear
Oh,
that.
me too.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
I
Then.
just
It's
went
not,
back to Pilates to see if it gets better.
I said we're looking at a second back surgery for me, unfortunately. But
Really?
that's yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
But again, it's whatever quality of life I can have with my two little kids. I gotta be able to
You
be.
have to try, yeah.
I have
Of
to.
course.
It's not me just sitting in pain. Hey, Dad, can't do this because no, I'll take whatever steps I have to.
Aaron, let me ask you one last question. I read and I saw on your webpage, Center for Suicide Awareness, that you have an award-winning documentary. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So this was actually prior to me coming to the center. So when people had talked about this, I was like, how do we talk about this? What do I say? So it's those we leave behind. And what the biggest thing is, it talks about the after effects of suicide, and it talks about the people that we have left behind. So what was really an amazing thing was when we started interviewing people about this, how open they were. And there was a couple people that had talked and said, yeah, they were. And I'm like, you shouldn't say were, like, they're still there. They're your life. Let's talk to them as if they were sitting in the room here, because they are so important. They need that. So what was amazing was award winning is more for one of the local things that we've had. So we had to really say that was very important to us, that this film brought a lot of attention to the families that were affected by suicide. And that was something that we really wanted to spotlight, because we understand that was their choice, but the families need to share that message too. And that was something we really wanted to get out there.
And I'm sure you go through the same thing that it happens to me, even with my guests. Suicide is one of those things that is silent, is a taboo, but once you start talking about it, everyone around you has a story, right? I'm sure this happens to
Yes,
you a lot.
absolutely.
Even with guests. The other day I wanted, because as you know, religion is a major thing when it comes to suicide. And I wanted to interview a rabbi, and I sent a message to a rabbi that I saw a TED talk with him, and he didn't really talk about suicide specifically, but he was very open about mental health. So I said, okay, I'm going to interview him. And I sent him an email, and he goes, Paula, I would love to be on your podcast, but I think you should interview this other rabbi. And he gave me this email. So, okay, he has more experience with it. And I said, well, maybe the
Sure.
community, right? So maybe the community. And I contacted him, and sure enough, his brother died of suicide. So he had
Wow.
a very
Wow.
personal,
So
story. Many times I interview someone who talks about mental health, and they come with the story of suicide.
yeah. Yeah. And that's the one thing I bring up a lot. And I give credit to all the people that have gone, like you said, you're a therapist. You've gone to school for five years to be that.
9.
Not okay, so not, yeah, sure, 9. But
Yeah.
but you know what? The one thing I tell people is you could go to school for 9 years, get the best degrees in the entire world, but if you don't have some connection to what you're doing, like
Yeah.
you with your father, you've had this lived life experience,
Hmm.
how people connect with you so much more because of that.
Totally
That's
different. Yeah.
yes, absolutely. It really is. And
Yeah.
I I am so happy to hear success stories from when you were talking about your father and you said, I have to figure out what I can do to help others. That's so important. And I
Mm.
don't think a lot of people do that. I think a lot of people really kind of swallow into themselves and say, this is my thing and I want to deal with it. But you really stepped up and did all of these amazing things that are helping so many people around the world.
Thank you. Thank you for your words.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
so to kind of I don't so I never really do questions. It's just more of like how we're doing this here. But I
Yeah.
do ask one specific question that I have to everybody on my podcast.
Okay.
Um, because I feel like this is such a good question to wrap up everything for you.
Mhm.
So what's your advice for anybody that's ever been in your position or has resonated with your story?
Open up, because when you do that, you don't only help yourself process your grief. And I'm talking about, of course, those who lost someone to suicide, but you help us in our fight against the stigma and the silence that's around suicide. So open up, use the word, name it.
That's I, I hear you on that. I hear you.
Yeah.
I open up, be honest, because there's power in being vulnerable. There
There
really
is.
is. And
Yeah.
that's why I am very open about sharing my stories. I'm
Mhm.
open to hearing other people because it's only going to, one, break that stigma, but two, it's going to make us all feel connected in a much closer realm than we do now.
Yeah.
And
And I'm glad you're not a police officer anymore. You
so am
stepped
I.
up. You stepped
So
up for your mental
it
health and for your, for your
it
family and for your life. And I'm really glad you made another choice.
thank you. Yeah, it's still weighing on me to this day. I wish there's certain aspects of it I miss, but I think I missed the camaraderie more than I missed the actual job. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
It's always that, isn't it? It's the
it's
people.
always you miss the people. You
Yeah.
miss
It's
the
always the
people you
people. It's
worked
not
with.
the
Yeah.
job.
No, no. I mean, I loved helping people. I mean, I just to kind of piggyback on that a little bit. I helped so many people in so many different ways, and I didn't realize the gravity of that until I wasn't in it anymore. Where I did some really amazing things while I was doing that to help others, but I wasn't helping myself, and that was
Yeah.
the problem. I needed to find that connection. So now that I'm done and I get to help people in this fashion, kind of the way that you are too, by talking to people, sharing, it's a different kind of help, but the
Mhm.
satisfaction level's still there.
Yeah. Well, Aaron, this has been great. If your listeners are interested, just go to my website. It's understandsuicide.com. Very easy.
Yep.
and you can find a lot of resources. I'll make sure. I was actually thinking about this today. I don't have a I have a section on podcasts, but it's my podcast if you click on it. But I'm going to have another. I have to open one because there's so many good podcasts, even the ones that are
It,
not suicide related. But I want to have a page just for resources specifically for podcasts.
um, so when we're done, don't leave right away. I'll help you out with that.
Okay. All
Just yeah.
right.
But and then as far as your listeners as well, if you're interested, we're on every platform as well. It's just the Center for Suicide Awareness podcast. Usually it's weekly, but because of the past couple months, it's not been weekly. So we're getting back on that train as winter comes up. But no, and Paula, thank you for having the time to talk with me and sharing your story and allowing me to share mine, because
You too.
it's very valuable to me.
You
It really
too.
is. So,
You too. Thank you so much. And thanks for all the work you're doing.
and thank you to you as well.